What's going on, guys, and welcome back. This is episode number 3 in this series that I'm doing for this drag and drop functionality. If you haven't seen the first 2 episodes, definitely head back and check those out, and I will actually leave a link to those videos in the description below. So let's jump right back into where we left off in the last video. So if you remember, we had just gotten, if we take a look actually first at where we ended up, we've got these items all listed out on the screen now, which is pretty cool. We've gotten most of the HTML and CSS in there that we need. There's still some stuff we're going to need to add. Obviously, we don't have images associated with all the items that we have, so obviously we don't want them all to show up in here. So a couple things that we can do and add to the function that we created last time is first, let's look at where we're actually excluding those. So we have a variable here called image ID, and I'm going to go ahead and add that in here. So if we have our image ID, and actually we're not going to set it to anything right here because we're actually setting it equal to something inside of this. So what we're doing at the top of here is we're calling that image ID, and we're setting it equal to a listed image IDs variable, and we're setting it to the current index that we're running through. And that's going to be that, or it's just going to be -1, meaning that if it doesn't find one at this index, it will just use -1. And so now you're probably wondering, well, what the heck is this variable? We haven't even talked about that yet. And that's true. And if we take a look at what that variable is, you'll see that it's right here. And so what this is just an array of numbers. And so these numbers are all associated with these images inside of this image library array that we're using here. And so this is where all the data is stored. So we have our actual image, and then we have our title for each of our images. And so this ID right here is what links this to our listed image IDs. So these IDs that are listed here are the images and the order that they will show up in. So if we want to get rid, obviously if we know we only have 6 items in this array, that means we should only have 6 of these on the screen. So if we first, since we're on our right side right now, we actually want to copy these and bring them over to our left side because we're definitely going to need them. Obviously we're already using our listed image IDs variable right here, and that's going to be setting it equal to, like I said, the number at that index, or it's just going to be -1 if it doesn't have one. So for the first of these, for the first 6, and actually we can take a look at what this looks like just by adding our item.setAttribute, and we're going to be setting that data image ID on this element equal to the image ID that we just created right here. So let's actually visualize what this looks like. So if we refresh the page now, nothing will have changed, but if we actually inspect the elements, you'll see now that they all have those data image ID properties right here. So you can see that data image ID is set to 57 for this one. For this one it's set to 5,567 and so on. But then you'll notice that the 6 down below are all set to -1 because they don't have actual images associated with them. So we can use that -1 value to basically hide these items if there isn't an image with them. So that's one more thing that we're adding inside of this function here. So inside of this class where we're actually setting the attributes for the class on the item, we want to go ahead and add something in here. So we're going to add a plus, and we're going to say that if the image ID in this case is less than 0, and that basically just covers anything less than 0, which includes -1, and then we're checking to see if it's that way, then we want to add a space, and we want to add that DD disabled class because that's what's going to hide the element from the view and also make it so that people can't click on it at all either. And then we're just saying, or if the image ID is greater than -1 or greater than 0 in this case, then we would set it equal to an empty string because we don't want to disable it. So now all we want to do is we want to jump back up to our CSS, and so where we're actually defining our item, we'll put another definition right here for our DD item, but we're also going to check to see is it a DD item and is it DD disabled. And if it's both of those classes, we're going to give it a pointer events of none to keep people from clicking on it, and then we're going to give it an opacity of 0 so that people can't see it. So now if we refresh the page, you'll notice that these items are still there, and you can still actually see them on our right hand side in our inspector window, but they're just hidden from the view so the user can't see them. And so now that we've added that class, we can jump back down into our draw images, and there's another thing that we want to add in here before we can start actually moving these around. We need to actually store all the information about each of the slots, and that's what we're doing here. So when we actually create the items, we're going to be saving in the width and height for each of the items, which in this case will be the same for all of them because they're all the same size. But the X and the Y value are what we're interested in because those values are going to change for each slot that we actually add to the screen. So if we take a look after we append the child here, we want to then set image slots, which first, before we actually start writing anything in there, we would like to make that into an array up at the top. So you'll notice that we have an image slots array on the right hand side, and we just need to go ahead and add that in on this side as well. So we have now our image slots array that starts as just an empty array. And now we want to push in new values for this when we're actually creating our items initially when the page loads. So when the page loads, we're going to run through each of these and we're going to set the image slots. And now we're going to be setting the image slots property of the slot ID. So we're taking whatever the slot ID is and we're making it a property inside of this array. And we're going to be setting it equal to an object now with all of those properties. So we're going to have the width as the item width, the height as the item height, and same with our X and Y values that we created previously as well. So the next thing we want to do is actually add a useful function that we're going to need inside of our actual mouse move function. So if you see, this is the function that actually moves stuff around, and we're using a function in here called getSlotID by coords. And so I'm actually just going to copy and paste this function over into our code, and I'll explain a little bit about what we're doing with it. So the idea is that we are able to pass in an X and a Y coordinate to this function, and then what it does is it runs through all of the slots right here, so the image slots that we just created here. It runs through all of those and it figures out which slot am I currently hovered over. And so like I said, this function is going to come in handy because we're actually going to need it inside of our mouse move function. Now that we have that pasted in here, I can actually start building a little bit of what we have first inside of our mouse down, because our mouse down function is obviously going to be when the user actually clicks down on the mouse. That's when we need to trigger this function. So we're going to set another function, like I said, for our image mouse down, and we're going to be passing an event property through, and that's what our E value is over here. It's just going to be the event for that actual listener. So this event property has a lot of stuff that you can use, but we're just going to be focusing on the target and the page X and Y values. So we need to define a few more global variables up here at the top. And these variables are going to be the ones that we have actually saved right here. And we're actually going to start with our selected, in this case, selected image element. And we're initializing that to null. And then we also have our original image slot, which is null. And then also, I skipped that one, the original click coords value, which will also be defaulted to null. And for now, I'm just going to put those three variables in here. So we're not actually setting them to anything. I mean, we're setting them to null for now, but we're going to be setting them to something different once we actually click down on the screen. So the first thing that we're doing here is we're creating an if statement, and this if statement is basically just to check to see that we don't already have a currently selected element. So as long as we don't have one already selected, we can then set the selected image element equal to, in this case, the event, and we're going to get the current target, which is going to be the element that you're clicking on, basically. So now that we have the actual element that you just clicked on, we also want to save the original click coordinates, which is basically the X and Y position on the window of where we just clicked. So we're saving that X value as the e.pageX and the Y value as that e.pageY, except in this case we're actually using our event variable and not e like we were on the right. And so before we continue, I actually want to create the function that we're calling here. So this is just to get the index of the image ID based on the image ID that we pass in. So we're finding where that actual image ID is inside of the array. So the array that we're talking about is actually this listed image IDs array. And so we're going to be passing in one of these numbers, and we need to find out where it is in this array. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump down and actually take a look where this function actually is. So that's our get image or get index of image ID. So we're going to take this function and we're going to copy that over because that's another useful function that we obviously need. So now that we have that function there, we can actually just set now our original image slot equal to, and if we take a look back up at what we're doing here inside of there, we're calling that get index of image ID. And now if you'll remember, we added our image IDs to all of our elements. So if this item has this data image ID, and those are the items that we're saving into here. So that's why we can just call to get our selected image element, and we're going to be getting an attribute now instead of setting it. We're going to be getting that data image ID value that was put onto that element. So now we're just finding where that actual ID is inside that array. And now the last two lines that we have here, manipulating the classes. So we're adding the DD selected class, and the DD selected class actually is right here, and all we're doing is just adding a Z index to that item that we just clicked on, and that's just to make sure that it's always sitting on top of all the other items while we're dragging it around. And we can just go ahead and paste that in, and then just go ahead and add that into our script as well. So here we're going to be taking that selected image element, and we're going to be accessing the class list, and we're going to be adding in that DD selected class now. And then we're also going to be removing the DD transition class because we don't want this element to try and be transitioning while we're moving it around. So we want to completely remove the transition altogether while we're moving the image, and then once we let go, we'll add that transition back to the image element. So now if we take a look inside of our mouse move function, let's actually create that first. So we're going to be creating our image mouse move function, and this is also going to take our event property. Because obviously when we're moving our mouse around the screen, we want to be able to track where the mouse is on the screen, and we want to get those X and Y coordinates. So the first thing is we want to check to see, is there actually a selected image element? Because if we're moving around the screen, we don't want to do anything unless we actually have an image selected. What we're doing now is we're saving another wrap property like we do in a lot of our other functions, and in this case we are getting that drag drop container again. So we're getting that drag drop element, and now what we're going to do is we're actually going to get the bounds of this element. So we got the bounds of our item or our slot last time, but we're going to be getting that bounding client rect. So we know the left and top position of this container based on the window. So the first property is the left, and we're going to be doing that bounds dot left, and then the top position, which is going to be the bounds dot top. So the next part we're doing here is actually saving our page X and Y values. So if I save page X as our event dot page X, and then our page Y as our event dot page Y, we now have the exact position of the cursor on the screen when this function is being called. And so now the next part is actually getting the difference between where they clicked on the screen, or where the cursor currently is on the window, relative to the container that all these elements are inside of. So the click X position is going to be that page X minus the left position, and the click Y is going to be that page Y minus the top position. And now we can actually use this really handy function that we already made for the get slot ID by coords. We can actually just copy that function because that's actually what we use to find which slot we're currently hovering over. So if we paste in this function now, we're going to be passing in those coords that we just created, which is the click X and that click Y value in this case. So the purpose of this variable is to figure out what slot we're currently hovering over, and to eventually just be able to check to see if that slot has changed, we need to now update the images so that they're in the correct positions. So what we're doing now is we're actually grabbing the element. So in this case, Ellie will be equal to that selected image element, and that's the element that we're currently dragging around right now. And then we're also getting the image ID, which now the image ID is basically just taking that selected image element and it's getting the attribute like we did previously in the first function up here. We're getting the attribute so that we can find that image ID. So we'll do that data image ID. And now what we're doing here is we're taking the index, which the index we actually saved when we first clicked down as well, because that's the image slot. So that's the original slot that this image was sitting in. And now we need to figure out what the new index is. So we need to figure out what slot are we currently in now. And so that's where this next function comes into play, which we actually have already defined right here. So the get index of image ID is going to figure out where is this image now in our array. So we paste that in here, and we're going to be passing in that image ID value that we just got from the element that we're currently selecting. And so now what we're doing is we're actually getting the X and the Y value of the slot that this thing originally started in. So we're actually taking our image slots array that we created and we're passing in the index now, which is the original image slot. And we're going to be grabbing that X value. If you remember when we created these image slots, we were giving them X and Y values. And so that's what we're getting right here is we're getting the whatever slot that this thing started in, we're getting its X position and we're getting its Y value as well. So we're going to be getting that image slots at the index.y. So we've made a lot of variables so far, and we just need to make 2 more because these are just going to be the result X and result Y values that we see here. This is finally going to give us the actual position of this item on the screen and where we need to actually put it. So when we do variable result X, we're going to be setting that equal now to the X value. If you remember, the X value is the X position of the slot originally. So where this image started before we started dragging it. And then we're now going to be adding to that because we need to add the page X value, which is basically where we clicked. But now we need to subtract from that the original click position. X. So we're basically getting the difference between where we are now and where we started, and then we're adding that to the original slot. And now we just need to do that exact same procedure for the Y value. So we're going to be doing the Y plus that page Y minus that original click coords dot Y. So now that we have that result X and result Y, next what we can do is actually set the transition or translate values for that. So we're just going to do one of these, but it's going to be that Ellie in this case, which if you remember, Ellie was set equal to the image that we're currently selecting. And we're going to be setting a style property on this, and we're going to be calling to transform this value, and we're going to be setting that equal to a translate 3D, and we're going to be updating this thing's position on the screen. So remember, this is what we started with when last time we worked with transitions. And so in this case, we're going to be setting the X and Y value of this transition equal to the result X and result Y properties that we just generated. And so it's probably going to look a little bit buggy when we try this, just because there's a few things that we're still missing. But we actually can see something happening on our screen if we do a couple more things here. So we need to actually add our mouse down listener to the item. So obviously we've created the item, but nothing is telling it to actually call that function when we click on it. So if we just under where we're actually appending it, we can just call on that item to add an event listener. And whenever we click the mouse down, we want it to call that image mouse down function. And so we won't worry about the mouse up yet because we actually haven't created that one. And we don't actually need to create it yet. And then, so you'll notice that there isn't a mouse move on here. And that's because if you do the mouse move on the actual item itself, it can be a little bit glitchy. So what we're going to do is actually add that mouse move property to our actual container instead. So whenever we're moving our mouse over the container, it will call that function. And that will still work fine for moving our items around. So what we're doing here is again grabbing our wrapper with our getElementById and we're going to be grabbing our drag drop and adding an event listener for when we actually do a mouse move in this case. And we're going to be calling that image mouse move function when we do so. So now if we go ahead and jump back over here, let's actually refresh this and see what's happening. So we have a console error, and let's see what this issue is because of. And it's because of the slot ID that we are setting inside of right here. So we actually are using a value here that we didn't actually set that value to anything, and we're using it here. And that was my mistake because I forgot to actually put that. You see, we have our definition for that slot ID here, and then we're setting it to, or we're adding a plus plus basically so that this thing goes from 0 up to our 12 in this case. But actually in this case, it's actually not necessary to define a new value. I'm just going to use I because I is going to be the exact same value that this is. I think I was using it in a different way before, and that's why I had that included. But in our scenario, we can just use I instead of slot ID. So now if we just save that change, I can jump back over, and now you'll notice that we have no more console errors. And then if we actually hover over one of these, and then I'm going to click down on it and start to drag, and you'll notice that we can now move this item around. But now if I let go of my mouse like I just did, it still just sits there on my cursor because there's nothing in there to tell it to stop once I let go. And so that's going to be the functionality that we actually set up in the next video, because there's a few things that we have to do to get that to work correctly and to also be able to put it back into its slot when you let it go. Alright guys, so that's going to conclude episode number 3 in this series. So it's pretty cool. We actually got our box moving around now with our mouse, and that's just the first step. So we're going to be able to get that actually animating in the next video, I'm sure. So be sure to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already for more content, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Peace.